So you've learned a lot over the past couple days about intelligence at really a couple different levels, at strategic, operational, and tactical levels. What I'm going to talk about today really, I think, applies to all of those. We're not going to get too deep in the weeds as far as bits and bytes. My goal today is really to teach you a little bit about yourself and about your thought process. One of the things I focus on in terms of my research is the intersection of human psychology and the investigative process. In our field, I think we're in a place where we're obviously a very young field, and most of the information we rely on is very tacit. It's not written down, it's not explicit, and we have a hard time teaching it. So I study the investigative process and what makes someone a good investigator, why investigations work, why they fail, those sort of things, and that, again, lives at the intersection of psychology and the investigative work that many of you do. So I'm going to talk today about curiosity, and there's no scene that I think better describes curiosity in a picture than this one. Of course, this is from Alice in Wonderland. There was a book written, and this was the cartoon that Disney made based upon that. The cartoon's wonderful. Many of us have probably seen it. And there is really early on in the book and in the movie, Alice sees a rabbit, and this rabbit is very peculiar in that it is wearing clothes and talking. She follows the rabbit. She chases it to the edge of this rabbit hole that you see here. And she has a decision to make. She can leave it be and go back to her ho-hum life as it was described in the book, or she can, as Morpheus would say, see how deep the rabbit hole goes. She, of course, chose the latter, and that was the premise for the entire book, and really the theme of the book is actually curiosity, because curiosity was indeed the thing that compelled Alice to go down and have the fantastical adventure down the rabbit hole that she had. So I love this picture as a setup for this particular talk. Now, the baseline knowledge you need to understand what I'm going to talk about is the fact that, generally speaking, we're all investigators in information security. This room specifically, in terms of intelligence analysis, even outside of information security, just generalized intelligence analysis, but especially in InfoSec, whether it be blue team work, red team work, we're all investigating something. And to understand how investigations work, you really need to understand the difference between perception and reality. So I want to do an exercise with you today, and it's going to require a little bit of participation. I'm not going to make you stand up, but I am going to make you close your eyes. So I want everyone to close their eyes with me. You just have to trust I'm not making faces at you. And I want you to imagine that your best friend has invited you over to their house for dinner. And you walk in, and you take a big whiff. And you smell it, the glorious combination of meat, cheese, and bread and sauce that is pizza, right? You smell it. You can't see it, but you smell it, right? It's in the other room. So there's a reality. You can open up your eyes at this point. As a matter of fact, Rick Holland, what's on your pizza? Brisket? That's a good pizza. You, sir, what's on your pizza? Pepperoni. Okay, so you can have anything on your pizza that you want at this point because it's only your perception. You don't see it, right? It exists in the other room. Maybe it's in the oven, but you can't actually see it. And there are a lot of things that influence what might be on your pizza, right? The folks I just asked, they're probably saying what's their favorite topping, right? So there's a memory component. You obviously have sensory input. You're smelling, and you can maybe discern some of the ingredients that are on it. Maybe you can smell green peppers or something like that, some of the more pungent type ingredients. Maybe you have memories of what your friend's favorite pizza is, or maybe he's cooked pizza for you before and you have that memory and you apply that. So you have all these different inputs that you're assimilating into your perception of the pizza. Does that perception necessarily equal the reality of the pizza? It doesn't. At some point the pizza is going to come and it's going to be put right in front of you and you're going to taste it, and then your perception and your reality will meet and become the same thing. Right? So that process I'm describing, the process of forming an initial perception, assimilating new information to it until you hopefully arrive at the accurate state of reality, that's what we do as investigators, right? Now, thinking about that in a more macro sense, there's another word for that, and it's called cognition, which is essentially a fancy word for learning, right? Investigating is essentially just learning about things. And the takeaway from that is if you can understand learning and the different things that go into it and how it works and what makes it excel and what makes it tougher, if you can understand those things, then you can better understand the investigative process. So our understanding of our own cognition is absolutely critical in understanding how we investigate. And curiosity is one of the biggest parts of that, in my opinion, specifically in our field. And so I'll continue to talk a little bit about that. Now, one of the reasons I'm talking about curiosity today is because I simply asked a lot of practitioners across our field, and I said, okay, what is the X factor? What is the thing in our field that is likely to make someone much more successful than their peers? And what you see on the screen here are several of the responses I received. And I would say over half of the responses I received were kind of in this vein. The ability to learn, the hunger for knowledge, persistence in education. I particularly liked this one. People who have a beast inside them that feeds on learning and knowledge. I like the sound of that, right? A beast. And so I'm going to stick with that theme as we go forward. And the beast is ultimately curiosity. It's a beast that lives inside of us, and it's defined simply by the desire to know. So there's two components there, right? The desire to know. Know, knowledge, gaining knowledge, learning and cognition that I just mentioned, and desire, which means there's a motivational aspect to it. So what that implies is, to some degree, there's a big sense of people who succeed in this field. It's simply a matter of having enough motivation to go out and grab the knowledge that is needed to succeed in it. And that's particularly useful in our field. Again, things are not written down. It's very tacit knowledge. Things aren't spoon-fed to us quite as much as some other fields, so we have to go out and actively seek it out and want to learn it. Now, to understand curiosity, I'll spend just a quick minute talking about information gap theory, which is really the leading theory. There are a few different theories. In psychology, there are multiple theories on everything, but probably the leading theory on what explains curiosity in psychology is what we call information gap theory. And I'll give you the quick dollar store rundown of that. To understand information gap theory, you have to understand that for any particular knowledge domain, and this can be all of information security, it can be programming, or it can be a very specific domain like an individual investigation, right? For any of those domains, there's what you know, and then there's your perception of what you don't know. It's not what you truly don't know. It's not all the knowledge that's available out there, but it's your perception of how much you don't know. So those are two specific set points, right? And in between them exists a gap, and that's where the opportunity for curiosity exists. And what you have at this point is a sense of deprivation, a sense of longing. There's information I don't have, and I want to go after it. Now, there's a subconscious gamble that's going on here, because we don't pursue every knowledge gap, right? We have this subconscious gamble that says, to achieve this level of knowledge, I'm going to have to do this amount of things, and this will be the impact, and this will be about a work required, and this will be the benefit, right? It's like a cost-benefit type trade-off. Now, we're not going to pursue all those things. Some of them we might. Speaking away from information security, I'll say I like to spend time woodworking, and that's a neat thing because I enjoy both the output, I create things that are useful, and I also enjoy the process, right? It's not just about output, it's also about enjoyment of the process. But I enjoy both those things, so I'm persuaded I am favorable on this subconscious gamble to pursue woodworking knowledge. Now, something I don't know a lot about is knitting, right? I don't know anything about knitting, surprise. And so we have this gap that exists, and I know that I will probably not enjoy the output of knitting. I don't really need those things, and I will probably not enjoy the process of it as well. So because of that, while I recognize that a gap exists between those, that opportunity for curiosity is there, I don't have genuine interest in that, so I'm not going to pursue it. Right? And so those are some non-technical examples, but it applies again on a macro scale about specific skills. You may not be interested in the process or the outcome of malware analysis, whereas you may be interested in both the process and the outcome of intelligence analysis or SOC analysis or red team pen testing type work and so on. So there's a sense of deprivation, and sometimes we choose to pursue it, and sometimes we don't, based generally upon general interest. Now, the literature in psychology tells us a couple other things about curiosity that kind of help define it as a positive trait. One of those is that it's positively correlated with intelligence. Now, we're a group of smart folks in here, so we know that correlation does not equal what? Very good, causation. Correlation does not equal causation. So while those are correlated, it doesn't necessarily mean that one causes the other. However, there is additional evidence to suggest that someone who is curious is likely to gain knowledge at a faster rate. Of course, gaining knowledge at a quick rate doesn't necessarily define intelligence. The definition of intelligence from a psychological standpoint is very diverse and a hot topic of debate depending upon who you ask. Psychology also tells us that curiosity is positively correlated with memory recall. So if we learn something, a piece of information, whether it be in an investigation or something else, if we learn it because it's motivated by curiosity, we're more likely to recall it easier. We're going to remember it better. And that has to do with the type of motivation that curiosity represents, and that's intrinsic motivation in most cases. We're internally motivated to seek out that knowledge, so we will more likely remember it versus something where we're extrinsically motivated. The other thing that's really interesting is with really any trait, a trait, for it to be a trait, has to be regulated by something. Right? Otherwise, any trait we have, we don't want it to go unchecked, or that's where you get into the realm of things like personality disorders. So curiosity is regulated by a strong trait. And to illustrate that, I want you to imagine that, and we've all probably been in a scenario like this, where you're walking down the street and you see a dog walking up, and the dog walks up to you really slowly, and it's walking very slowly, and maybe you reach down because you want to pet it, or maybe you walk towards it, and the dog runs off in the other direction. Right? It's scared of you. It's fear. So if we think about curiosity as one side of the evolutionary coin, fear would be the other side of it. Fear regulates curiosity. Some things in nature don't have a strong fear instinct. That's the whole phrase, curiosity killed the cat, right? So we have to think about fear as the countering trait. And that's important to realize because fear essentially limits us. It limits and our curiosity beast, it kind of causes us to starve it sometimes. So I'll talk about more of that in a minute. But essentially, curiosity is a positive trait. We do have things in psychology literature that do tell us that and inform us of that. Now, the other thing is that curiosity, generally speaking, also helps us describe what I call the Jack and Diane problem. So you have Jack and Diane, two American kids growing up in the heartland who wanted to be intelligence analysts. And let's say for all intents and purposes, everything's equal. They have the exact same background, same skill set, same socioeconomic background, same training, and then you put them in the exact same job with the same responsibilities and exact same tasks, and you leave them there 5 years, and you come back later and talk to the management, and you say, how's it going? And they say, okay, let's say in this case, Diane is outperforming Jack in every single way in their roles as an intelligence analyst. And you ask, okay, what is the trait that Diane has in this case that has compelled her to much greater success? And of course, no surprise, I'm going to say, all things being equal, curiosity is the prevailing trait that exists there. It's that desire to know, that hunger for knowledge. Diane's curiosity beast is getting fed at a more regular rate, and she's insatiably curious about the task at hand. Now, what the Jack and Diane problem helps us realize is that we think about experience too often in wrong ways. How do people normally measure experience? Years, right? I heard some people say years, right? And that's really the worst measure of experience because just like the Jack and Diane problem illustrates, two people with the exact same background and same experience may excel in dramatically different ways, right? So what do we mean when we say experience? Well, generally we mean expertise, but specifically diversity and to some degree duration, but mostly diversity of expertise. That's generally what we're talking about when we talk about experience. So if we were to actually map experience based upon that premise over the course of a career, we might see something like this, where in the top would be Diane and the bottom would be Jack, and the defining characteristic is curiosity. So curiosity essentially helps define how quickly we gain diversity of experience, or diversity of expertise, aka experience. Now this manifests in a couple different ways, and I kind of put it on this chart here. And notice we have green is obviously good, red is bad. I guess if you're colorblind, green is the top, red is the bottom. I probably could have chosen better colors for that, but here we are. And the defining characteristic here is not experience, it's actually curiosity. Of course, the ideal quadrant of this is the high curiosity, high expertise, high experience quadrant at the top right, where someone excels. But most of us started, or hopefully we started, right across from that in the high curiosity, low experience area. And that's fine, right? The word I used to describe that is jumpy. We've all known people in the SOC who they don't know what normal is, so everything looks malicious, and they're always thinking everybody's trying to hack into their stuff, and it's just like it's a stock ticker or something like that, or some random periodic thing, and it's not malicious at all. That's jumpiness, and that's okay. A self-awareness of that jumpiness is critically important, and even more so, mentorship and strong leadership to help put up a little bit of guardrails in that regard is super helpful, some coaching, so to speak. But jumpy is good. You can work with jumpy. What you can't work with is ineffective or apathetic. Ineffective being someone who has very little diversity of expertise and low curiosity, so that they're not going to gain that expertise at a very quick rate at all. And then apathetic is someone, we've all known folks like this who are really experienced, and maybe they were really high curiosity at one point in their life, and then they kind of phoned it in for whatever various reasons. And they've essentially become apathetic, and they rely too heavily on their experience and are more resistant to gaining new knowledge that especially conflicts with that experience. Right? So this is kind of how I see curiosity and experience generally racking up, and curiosity, again, has a dramatic impact on our career development, not just at the micro scale with individual investigations, but the macro scale and how we develop our careers over time, not unlike Jack and Diane. So the natural question here becomes, okay, you know, I know a little bit about curiosity now, but can I become curiouser? Can I become more curious? And I think the answer is, generally speaking, yes. And I want to talk about a few of the ways we can do that. Before we do it, I have to talk about measuring curiosity, because anytime you want to increase the level of something, you probably need to be able to measure it to some degree so you can scientifically validate if you're actually increasing things, because you have baselines, you can do controlled experiments, et cetera. And I won't get too much into that, but I will say from a physiological sense, we can measure curiosity via fMRI. So fMRI is a relatively newer medical technology wherein we can measure the increased activity in certain regions of the brain. It's a very expensive thing. It's not super accessible for researchers, but there are a lot of researchers who are doing it. And I believe it was Stanford who did this research, and they basically found what are essentially the curiosity centers of the brain, the places in the brain wherein when someone is more curious in a particular scenario, that higher levels of activity are seen. Those three areas are the midbrain, the nucleus accumbens, and the parahippocampal gyrus. Now, I tell you that not because it's useful to you, but because saying parahippocampal gyrus makes me feel smart. I take it where I can get it. So you see those highlighted on the screen there. Now, that said, not everybody can measure things with fMRI, so another area of psychological research is how do we measure this via simple testing, right? And there are a lot of ways to do that. Generally speaking, they're focused on measuring things in terms of curiosity as a generalized trait, not specifically applied to an individual field, but as a generalized trait. And it works to some degree. It's psychometrically valid, but only just so. It's not necessarily one of those things that we rely on too super heavily. There are a few different ways to do it. I say that they're not situationally specific here because to be more specific, they need to be applied to more specific scenarios. So we don't necessarily have that in intelligence analysis yet. I think we will at some point. We're just not quite there yet. And we don't honestly have a lot of people looking at this with those types of skills right now. So we'll get there, but one of the leading examples of this is the Curiosity and Exploration Inventory, now in its second version. So I took this and I said, hey, let's do some numbers with this. And I asked some interesting questions. And one of those I asked was, okay, are information security practitioners, generally speaking, more curious per this scale? So I did that with, in this case, about 275 folks, which is a reasonable sample size. I would want to do more before I publish a paper on it or anything like that. It's reasonable, but not great. And I went across several fields. And you see at the bottom we have security, and then above that we have general technology, so like network admins, sysadmins, non-security practitioners, and then practitioners of the law or of medicine. What I found amongst my groups was that, yes, in this case, security folks do seem to be more curious per this particular scale. Now, I add per this particular scale because if you want to learn more about this, you need to go and research the scale on yourself and learn what its strengths or weaknesses are. That's an important part of this type of science. Now, the results of this don't surprise me too much. I would guess that security folks are more curious, generally speaking, because, again, security knowledge is mostly tacit. It's not spoon-fed to us. We have to actively seek it out to be good at our jobs, whereas that's not necessarily the case with medicine or with law, where the knowledge is a lot more explicit and written out and a little bit easier to come by versus what we have in security. Now, the next question I asked was inside the realm of security. We obviously have all these different specializations. So we have red team, blue team, et cetera, et cetera. I said, were there specific groups within security practitioners that were more curious than others? Does anybody have a thought on which group within security practitioners is more curious than others? Somebody said red team? IR? Okay, so I'll tell you, my guess was red team. That would have been my guess, which, so I was very surprised by the results. So you see here we have the general security industry at the top. We have people who consider themselves generalists, more half network admin, half security people in the second group. And then we have NSM, IR, and pen testing. I don't have an adequate sample size yet to report on specifically enough people who identify primarily only as Intel folks. Most people do Intel as a function of these other things in our field. But this was the results I came out with. And I was very surprised to see pen testing was actually lower than some of the other things. So as is the way with this type of data, you know, the results were not as I expected. I was welcoming of being wrong. That's always a good thing. But then I kind of had to think backwards and think, okay, how could these results be justified? And I think where I'm at on this right now is generally has to do with reward systems. In pen testing, your reward system is very clear and observable, right? You either get in or you don't. You get the access or you don't. You get to the particular information asset or you don't. And it's a pretty clear reward system, which I think has an adverse effect on curiosity. Whereas in NSM, and even to some degree IR, but particularly in NSM, you never know if you're winning, right? You never know if you're going to get a reward at all. Some people go many, many years in their NSM or alert analysis career, and they never know if they never catch anything, and they never know if they're doing a good job. And I think that to some degree can increase curiosity. I think in some situations it can have a negative effect. But that's what the data is telling me now. A sample size of this group is about 200. I want to continue to do more research, break out more individual groups there and see what I can find out, and maybe even add some additional surveys to this just to learn more about the differences there, because that was very surprising to me. I think most people who, when I asked that a minute ago, said red team. That would have made more sense. But I guess not, so red teamers can eat it. Now, growing curiosity. So this is the part I think a lot of people are the most interested about, is how can we be more curious people? And what those fMRI studies that I talked about earlier said that was particularly interesting in the context of those, and I'll provide links to these papers, you can read about it yourself, but they said curiosity peaks when you believe you're equally likely to know or to not know something, right? So what that is saying essentially is that requisite knowledge on a topic matters. So if you think of what you're likely to know about something in a given investigation or a given scenario, if you believe you're not going to know anything about it, 0%, you're not going to be very curious about it. If you believe you know everything about it, then you're not going to be very curious about it. But if you're in that middle range, that 40 to 60% range of likely or not likely to know something, like you have enough requisite knowledge, then you're going to be more curious about it. And this is backed up by those fMRI results. So I actually want to go through a couple quick examples of this, and we'll start with curiosity in daily life. So let's say you're talking to me, and you ask me, hey, Chris, what did you do last night? Right? I could have done many, many things last night. You have no idea what I did, so you don't really have any requisite knowledge. As a matter of fact, you probably don't necessarily even care about the answer. You're probably just making small talk, right? Fair enough. We all do it. So at this point, your curiosity is not very piqued. But let's say I answer, and I say, okay, I went to a concert at Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta, and I just leave it at that. Right? Well, now you have some requisite information about it. You know I went to a concert. You know, Mercedes-Benz Stadium is the big football stadium. There's only so many acts that would perform there. Maybe you know a little bit about music. You might could guess who is performing there. Right? You have some knowledge of things that will pique your curiosity. You don't have all the knowledge. Because let's say instead of this answer, I gave you this answer. I went to a concert at Mercedes-Benz Stadium and saw Garth Brooks. Right? Well, now you know where I went, you know what I did, and that's going to essentially crush curiosity for that specific scenario. Now, you may have an interest in Garth Brooks or the concert. You may genuinely be interested in how it went or something like that, and that may be your follow-up question. But specific to this piece of knowledge, by selectively excluding who I saw at the concert, I'm piquing curiosity because I'm giving you just enough information to pique curiosity and ask an interesting question. Right? Let's look at something a little more topical. Let's say you're looking at a host and you find a file that doesn't look familiar. Now, truthfully, most of the files on an operating system are not familiar to us, right? There are tens of thousands of files on Windows, and we don't know what most of them do without Googling it, right? That's fair assessment. So unless the file is found in a weird place or has a weird name or there's something else about it that tells us it's suspicious, if we just see a file that doesn't look familiar, we're probably going to gloss over it, right? So we're not very curious about it. We don't have enough information that makes us curious about it. But let's say in this case, let's say we found the file in the context of finding a scheduled task that we don't expect. So we know our sysadmins, we know that we shouldn't see any scheduled tasks that we don't expect, and we find a scheduled task that's on a system that links to this file. Well, many of us know that scheduled tasks are often used for persistence mechanisms for the bad guys, and now we have just enough knowledge where we believe, again, right in the middle of here, where we're equally likely to know or not know whether this is malicious or how malicious it is or what it does, and that is where peak curiosity is going to live. So instead of 0% or 100%, we're in that 40 to 60% range, and we're likely to be more curious about this based upon the context of what it was found. And context is the key word here, right? Because we need that context in our tools in order to pique curiosity at the right times to make sure we pursue the right things. So if you are if you build your own sim, or you work for a sim builder, or you work for a vendor, or you're considering becoming a vendor, I urge you consider context at all points of the investigation. And not everything has to create an alert, right? Not everything is alert worthy. I think during the SSL and TLS talk yesterday, it was mentioned the concept of decoration, right? And that's something that's often overlooked, is taking data and adding additional context to it so that that's available, and not necessarily alert-worthy, but available in the context of other investigations. Because the context of this file is involved in a scheduled task is critically, critically important to piquing the curiosity and pushing us to pursue the investigation further. Right? In investigations, generally, we are our own worst enemies. It's our biases and our lack of curiosity in some cases that fail to push us forward. But this type of thing, the appropriate context, is going to let us continue forward and make sure we don't miss things. Very quickly, we talk about feeding the beast, and having that requisite knowledge that I talked about, and feeding the beast in that regard is important, but also you don't want to starve the beast as well. And that's where something called rapid gap awareness comes in. So I mentioned we have our knowledge point and our reference point, and there's obviously a gap between those two things. And I think most of us know, who have been in the field for a while, that really, especially with information security and intelligence work, the longer you do this, the more you realize you don't know about it, right? And that's really a sign of expertise, is not just knowing what you know, but knowing what you don't know. So even though your knowledge may grow over time, the gap is also going to grow, and it's generally going to outpace it in this field, right? The gap of things you don't know is generally going to do that. And that's going to happen slowly over the course of a career, but it doesn't always happen slowly. And I'll give you an example in IT and security that I see a lot. Someone maybe doesn't have a lot of coding experience, and they say, you know what, I want to learn to write Python code. That would be good for my career. I could do some cool stuff. That would be neat. So they go out and they write their hello world. They do some if-then-else statements. They make some little dinky things that are probably not too useful, but they're good learning exercises. And then they say, okay, I want to do something really practical, really real world. Maybe they want to write a screen scraper, maybe some type of data analysis tool. So they start Googling around for examples. They inevitably end up on Stack Overflow, and then they run into the world of, okay, what are functions? I don't understand how classes work. Why are there 14 external libraries? And why is everybody doing this and arguing with each other about how there are 8 different ways and every way is better, but nobody can explain why, right? Stack Overflow in a nutshell. So they find that, and basically what happens at that point, whereas they're learning a lot, and their knowledge point and the reference point, maybe they're getting closer together, then all of a sudden, that reference point of what they don't know grows dramatically, right? They feel like they're making progress, and then it just grows dramatically, and they realize, wow, there's so much I don't know. The rate at which that growth happens matters, and that's where we get into this concept of rapid gap awareness. And as you see here, the red line, as awareness grows very quickly, it basically causes the motivational aspect of curiosity to have the inverse effect, right? So it's almost less about starving the curiosity beast and more about kicking him right in the stomach, right? It's a very massively demotivating thing. And this is where most learning from a topical and a skills perspective fails, right? That's where most of the time the guy who's trying to learn, the guy or girl who's trying to learn Python, they run into this and then they walk away from it and they never come back, or they come back 2 years later and the same thing happens over and over again, right? So this is one of the big things that's working against us. Now the good thing is, simply by being aware of rapid gap awareness and knowing how it affects you, you're better equipped to deal with it, and particularly for those of you who are managers, you're better equipped to recognize it in the folks you manage or your peers, right? That's very critically important. So recognizing that is very important to make sure you're preventing gut punches to the curiosity beast. So we're about to wrap up. I'll mention a couple other points related to feeding and or not starving the beast. And I'll also mention feeding the beast is important, not starving it is also important, but also binge and purge is not good either, right? We don't want to feed the beast one day and then kick him in the gut the next day. So that's important. One of the things I mentioned was that fear regulates curiosity. The number one way I see that manifest is by fear of asking questions. And we've all been there in school where the teacher's talking about something and then all of a sudden they lose you, right? And you have a question and you want to ask it, but you don't. And you probably don't ask it because, one, you're afraid you're going to look dumb, right? There are people in the room who may or may not be smarter than you. You don't want to appear you don't want to appear dumb in that regard. Whether or not you will or not, that's your perception of the matter. And maybe the other thing is maybe you just zoned out for a moment and maybe the teacher said the thing that you needed to hear, but you missed it, and you don't want to be scolded by the teacher because you zoned out, right? So fear in that case is preventing you from asking the question that you need to spur on your knowledge, but it's also killing your curiosity. It's starving your curiosity beast in that regard. So being aware of that's important. You can kind of help self-regulate your fear, but I think it's a liberating thing for people when they recognize that, hey, this fear is preventing me from my curiosity from thriving. It's preventing me from learning about this particular thing, preventing me from pursuing this particular aspect of an investigation. Liberating that type of fear is a good and positive thing. Me talking about it, that's easy. Actually doing it is hard. I recognize that. I fall victim to it as well. Here in a minute, I'm going to ask y'all for questions, and there will be folks who won't ask questions because they're afraid of something, right? And I would encourage you to try to suppress that as best you can and ask as many questions as you can within the time we have allotted. But recognizing that fear is what regulates curiosity is the key thing here. Cognitive resources also matter. We have this concept of being mentally tired, right? You do a really hard job all day that's really mentally taxing. You get to the end of the day, you can't handle anything else. You just want to zone out and watch TV. That's a real thing, right? Our cognitive resources are limited, and I often think about cognitive resources in terms of a gas tank, right? You only have so much in a given day, and it depletes over time, and there's things you can do to kind of fill it back up a little bit, you can eat. The brain obviously runs on glucose and some other things, so eating and nutrition is important. You can take a nap. That's helpful for some people as well. But that matters. And you also, the really important thing I think for us here is thinking about that also in terms of miles per gallon, right, of that cognitive resource tank. So you can only apply so much attention and focus to a particular thing. And if you think about your attention, which is how you apply these cognitive resources, as a spotlight, and the more intense that spotlight is, the lower your cognitive miles per gallon are. Right? So if you have one single task, one single investigation, maybe you're just looking at alerts all day, every day, and you're intensely focused all day, your miles per gallon on your cognitive resources are really, really low, and that negatively affects your curiosity. And for that reason, I generally recommend, basically, instead of having your foot on the gas, full throttle all day, you kind of vary it a little bit. And the best way to do that is not to, not work for a couple hours. Most of our employers wouldn't like that. But it's more specifically to have multiple work streams. And because when you switch context between work streams, you vary your focus, right? So that's, again, 100% throttle, maybe back to 20, to 50, back to 20, that sort of thing. And you're getting better miles per gallon. It also allows you to get a fresh perspective on what you're looking at, which I believe was something Carmen mentioned in her keynote yesterday, was that fresh perspective, looking at things with a little bit of a clean slate, and having multiple work streams is critically important. So one of the things, I spend a lot of time consulting in SOX, and one of the things I tell people is if you have analysts who their only job is ever looking at alerts, and that's all they ever do, first of all, they're going to burn out very quickly, but also you're massively underutilizing them because you're getting very low miles per gallon in terms of their cognitive workload, and it's crushing, starving their curiosity beast. So multiple work streams is important. I recommend at any given time, anybody in our field should have at least 3 tasks that they can switch between. 2 to 4 is the sweet spot, so 3 is right in the middle of that. Finally, gaining exposure to new rabbit holes, right? Back to the Alice in Wonderland example. A lot of us here, we're all here because we're interested in intelligence, and it's great to read everything you can about intelligence. But oftentimes we have to realize and step back and realize we are a much smaller cog in what is a much greater picture. Thomas mentioned that this morning in his keynote in so many words, wherein that sometimes we really need to step back and look at the global perspective of what's happening, and that often means combining and fusing different ideas from different places to get fresh perspective. So if you're into intel analysis, that's great, but you need to read and be involved with and understand other facets of what we do. For me, that's psychology. That's the thing I'm interested in, and merging that with information security and learning from a much more well-established field and combining those things has been really useful for me, and I hope as a result really useful to many of y'all as well. But it doesn't have to be history. I mean, Thomas this morning, he's a historian, right? He's talking about history and combining those things. And most of our history, not only is it yet to be defined, we're yet to define how we're going to define it because our field is so young. So there's so much opportunity there. It can be math with advanced statistics and advanced detection. Any of these other fields, bringing those in and learning about those things, it's very valuable. And I would also add the thing I don't have on the slide is learning about social strife and economies and places where things are not as great as they are in this country, right? People who struggle and learning about those struggles and learning about how what we do affects those struggles. I spend a lot of time thinking about that in regards to rural areas, and it puts into perspective not only how what we do is so important sometimes, but also how what we do sometimes can also be so disconnected from problems that really, really matter, and maybe we can apply our skill sets in unique ways to do cool things about those as well, which I think is a really neat thing to try to do. So, all told, you have a beast inside you. It's the curiosity beast. I've talked about some strategies on how you can feed it, how you can try to avoid gut punching it. I think that's it. My name's Chris Sanders. That's Mayfield, Kentucky. Thank y'all, folks.